Chapter 1. A Divided Land. Ukraine is a place full of history. Its land is wide and beautiful, with golden fields and strong rivers. For centuries, it was home to many cultures. People spoke different languages. They sang different songs. But they all called Ukraine their home. Yet, life was not always peaceful. Ukraine is in a special place on the map. It lies between two big powers, Russia to the east and Europe to the west. For years, these powers fought over Ukraine. Who would control it? Who would decide its future? These questions shaped Ukraine's story. In the past, Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was a group of countries controlled by Russia. Life was hard for many Ukrainians during that time. People had to follow strict rules. They could not speak freely. Many felt trapped. In 1991, everything changed. The Soviet Union broke apart. Ukraine became an independent country. People celebrated in the streets. They dreamed of a free and happy future. But independence brought challenges. Building a new country is never easy. Some people in Ukraine wanted to be closer to Europe. They wanted to join the European Union, EU. They believed this would bring jobs, freedom, and a better life. But others looked to Russia. They felt connected to its culture, language, and history. This created a divide. Neighbors began to see the world differently. Old friendships started to break. In 2013, these tensions grew stronger. Ukraine's president at the time, Viktor Yanukovych, made a big decision. He chose not to sign an agreement with the EU. Many Ukrainians were upset. They felt their future was stolen. Protests began in the capital city, Kyiv. Thousands of people gathered in Maidan Square. They waved flags and sang songs. They called for change. The protests lasted for months. Winter came, but people stayed in the cold. They built fires to keep warm. They believed in their cause. Ukraine deserves better, they shouted. But the government tried to stop them. Police used force. There was violence. Lives were lost. The world watched as Ukraine fought for its future. Finally, in February 2014, President Yanukovych fled the country. Protesters celebrated. They believed they had won. A new government came to power. Many hoped for peace. But this was just the beginning of a new struggle. Russia did not like what was happening in Ukraine. It saw the new government as a threat. In March 2014, Russian soldiers appeared in Crimea, a region in southern Ukraine. They wore no badges or flags, but everyone knew who they were. Soon, Russia announced that Crimea was now part of its territory. The move shocked the world. People asked, "Can this be allowed?" But no one stopped Russia. Ukrainians felt betrayed. "We lost a part of our country," they said. Anger and sadness spread. After Crimea, the situation got worse. In eastern Ukraine, in places like Donetsk and Luhansk, people started fighting. Some wanted to join Russia. Others wanted to stay with Ukraine. The fighting turned into war. Villages were destroyed. Families had to run away. The beautiful land of Ukraine was now a battlefield. The war in the East brought pain to everyone, but it also showed something powerful: the strength of the Ukrainian people. Soldiers defended their towns. Volunteers brought food to the front lines. Artists painted murals of hope. Even in the darkest times, Ukrainians did not give up. Today, Ukraine is still divided in many ways, but its people have a shared dream. They want a country where they can live freely. They want to protect their culture and land. They want peace. This is the story of Ukraine, a land full of struggles, but also full of strength. Its journey is far from over. But as history has shown, Ukraine will always fight for its future. The road ahead may be long, but its people are ready for the challenge. And that is the heart of this divided land. Chapter 2. The First Signs of Trouble. In 2014, everything in Ukraine began to change. People were tired. They wanted something new, something better. They wanted to feel free. For years, Ukrainians looked to Europe. They dreamed of joining the European Union, EU. They believed it would bring new jobs, open borders, and brighter futures. Many young people wanted a life full of possibilities. At first, the future seemed hopeful. The government talked about signing a big agreement with the EU. People were excited. But then, suddenly, everything stopped. Ukraine's president, Viktor Yanukovych, said no to the EU deal. Instead, he chose to stay closer to Russia. This decision shocked the country. People felt betrayed. They gathered in Kiev, the capital. They went to Maidan Square, a large open area in the center of the city. Thousands of people stood together. They waved Ukrainian flags and sang the national anthem. Their voices were full of hope and anger. "We want change," they shouted. "Ukraine is Europe." The protests in Maidan Square grew bigger each day. Families came. Students stood side by side with workers. Even during the freezing winter, they refused to leave. They built tents and fires to stay warm. The square became a city of hope. But the government was not happy. They wanted the protests to stop. Police were sent to Maidan. They carried shields and batons. At first, they only stood and watched, but soon things turned violent. On a cold night in January, the sound of gunfire echoed through the square. Smoke filled the air. People screamed and ran. Others stood their ground. They refused to give up. Many were hurt. Some lost their lives. The square became a symbol of courage, but also of great sadness. By February 2014, the protests had reached their peak. The people won. President Yanukovych fled Ukraine. The government changed, and a new future seemed possible. People hoped the worst was over. But in the east, far from Maidan, another storm was brewing. Crimea, a beautiful peninsula in southern Ukraine, was calm at first. But then, strange things began to happen. One day, soldiers appeared on the streets. They wore green uniforms, but they had no flags. No one knew exactly who they were. But their faces, their weapons, and their language told a clear story. They were Russian soldiers. The people of Crimea were confused. Some were happy. They thought Russia would bring them a better life. but others were afraid. They didn't want to leave Ukraine. In March 2014, Russia took control of Crimea. They held a vote. The results said that most people wanted to join Russia, but many in the world did not believe it was fair. They said the vote was illegal. "Crimea is Ukraine," Ukrainians cried. But Russia did not listen. The world began to pay attention. Leaders from other countries spoke out. They called Russia's actions wrong. Some countries placed sanctions on Russia. They tried to stop trade and hurt its economy. But Russia did not back down. Soon, trouble spread to the eastern parts of Ukraine. In Donetsk and Luhansk, groups of people wanted to break away from Ukraine. They said they wanted to be part of Russia. Others in the region wanted to stay Ukrainian. This caused fights in the streets. It didn't take long for these fights to turn into battles. The Ukrainian government tried to stop the chaos. Soldiers were sent to the east. But the situation grew worse. Entire towns were destroyed. Families fled their homes. Children cried as they left everything behind. Russia said it was not involved in the fighting, but weapons and soldiers crossed the border into Ukraine. The world could see what was happening, but no one could stop it. By the end of 2014, Ukraine was at war. What had started as protests for change had turned into a fight for survival. The country was divided. Crimea was gone. The east was in flames. But Ukrainians did not lose hope. They worked together. Volunteers brought food and supplies to soldiers. Neighbors helped each other rebuild homes. People sang songs to remind themselves of their strength. The world continued to watch. What would happen next? No one knew. But one thing was clear. Ukraine was in danger, and its people were ready to fight for their future. The first signs of trouble had grown into a storm. But storms do not last forever. Ukrainians believed in brighter days ahead. Their story was far from over. Chapter 3. The War in the East. After the protests in Kyiv, Ukraine entered a new chapter. The government changed. People in the capital dreamed of peace. But far in the east, trouble was growing. In the spring of 2014, fighting broke out in Donetsk and Luhansk. These cities, once full of life, became battlegrounds. Groups of armed men appeared on the streets. Some wanted to leave Ukraine and join Russia. Others wanted to stay united with Ukraine. The arguments quickly turned violent. Soldiers from the Ukrainian army arrived. They set up checkpoints and camps. But it wasn't enough. The streets filled with smoke and fire. Buildings were destroyed. Shops were empty. People were afraid. Tatiana, a mother from Donetsk, was one of many who had to leave her home. One morning, she heard loud explosions. Her windows shook. She grabbed her daughter, Alina, and ran to the basement. "Stay quiet," she whispered, holding her daughter close. They stayed in the dark, waiting for the noise to stop. The next day, Tatiana packed a small bag. She took only what she could carry: clothes, some food, and a photo of her family. "We can't stay here," she said to Alina. Together, they joined hundreds of others fleeing the city. Some walked, others drove. They didn't know where they were going. They only knew they had to get away. In the countryside, the sounds of war were quieter, but life was hard. Refugees lived in crowded shelters. Families shared small rooms. They slept on floors and ate whatever they could find. "We will go home soon," Tatiana told Alina. But deep down, she wasn't sure if that was true. In Luhansk, the fighting was just as bad. The city's streets were full of holes from bombs. Schools were closed. Hospitals struggled to help the injured. Electricity and water were often cut off. People stood in long lines for bread. Some gave up and left. Others stayed, hoping the war would end. In the middle of all this, Ukrainian soldiers fought to protect their country. Many were young men who had never seen war before. They learned quickly. Every day they faced danger. Bullets flew overhead. Explosions shook the ground. But they kept fighting. One soldier, Dimitro, remembered the day he joined the army. "I had no choice," he said. "This is my home. I have to defend it." He carried a photo of his parents in his pocket. Whenever he felt scared, he looked at it. It reminded him why he was fighting. The war in the East was not just about land. It was also about identity. People in Donetsk and Luhansk spoke Russian and Ukrainian. Some felt close to Russia. Others felt part of Ukraine. This division made the war even more painful. Neighbors became enemies. Friends stopped speaking to each other. Families were torn apart. The fighting grew worse as the months went by. Tanks rolled through the streets. Missiles hit apartment buildings. The sound of gunfire never seemed to stop. People lived in fear, always listening for the next explosion. The world watched in horror. Leaders from other countries tried to help. They called for peace. They held meetings. They signed agreements. But the war did not stop. Instead, it spread. Villages outside Donetsk and Luhansk were caught in the crossfire. Farms were burned. Bridges were destroyed. Fields once full of wheat and sunflowers were now empty and gray. Yet even in the darkest times, there were moments of hope. Volunteers from across Ukraine came to help. They brought food, clothes, and medicine to those in need. Churches opened their doors to refugees. Artists painted murals of peace on the walls of broken buildings. One day, a group of children in a small town decided to plant flowers. They found seeds in an old shop and dug holes in the ground. "The war will not last forever," one boy said. "When it ends, the flowers will grow." The war in the East changed everything. It left scars on the land and on the people. But it also showed their strength. Ukrainians refused to give up. They held on to their dreams of peace, even when it felt impossible. The war was far from over. More battles would come, more families would flee, but Ukraine's spirit remained strong. The people knew one thing for sure: they would not let their country disappear. The world continued to hope for peace. But peace, like the flowers the children planted, would take time to grow. Chapter 4. Invasion Begins. February 24th, 2022. It was still dark outside when the first explosions shook Ukraine. People were sleeping, unaware of what was coming. Suddenly, the sound of sirens filled the air. Families woke up in panic. Windows rattled. Fear spread like a fire. In Kyiv, Olena heard the noise from her apartment. She rushed to the window and saw flashes of light in the distance. Her husband, Andriy, grabbed the radio. "Missiles are hitting cities," he said, his voice trembling. "It has begun." They stood in silence, their hearts pounding. Across Ukraine, the news was the same. Russian tanks were crossing the borders. Planes roared in the sky. Missiles hit airports, military bases, and neighborhoods. The invasion had started. People did not know what to do. Should they stay or leave? Where could they go? Roads filled with cars as families tried to escape. Many packed quickly, grabbing only what they could carry. Others went underground, hiding in basements and metro stations. They hugged their children tightly, whispering, "It will be okay." But no one knew if it would. In the city of Kharkiv, near the Russian border, the attack was fierce. Explosions rocked the streets. Yaroslav, a teacher, watched as buildings around him crumbled. "It feels like the end of the world," he said. Yet, even as bombs fell, he refused to leave his city. "This is my home," he told his friends. "I will not abandon it." In the south, Russian forces moved quickly. They aimed to take control of major cities like Kherson and Mariupol. Soldiers marched through villages and tanks rumbled past fields. Farmers stood in disbelief as war arrived on their quiet land. The capital, Kyiv, became a key target. Russian troops advanced, hoping to capture the heart of Ukraine. But Kyiv was not ready to fall. Its people prepared to defend it. Men and women joined the army. Volunteers filled sandbags and made barricades. Grandmothers sewed camouflage nets. Even the smallest acts became acts of courage. A bakery stayed open, handing out free bread. A young boy painted a sign that said, "We will not give up." Across the city, the message was clear. Kyiv would fight. As the days passed, the war grew worse. Cities like Mariupol were surrounded. Food and water ran out. Hospitals overflowed with the wounded, yet the people held on. In the darkest hours, they found strength in each other. The world watched in shock. On television, images of burning buildings and crying children filled the news. Leaders condemned Russia's actions. Many countries sent weapons and aid to Ukraine. "We stand with Ukraine," they said. Protests took place in cities across the globe. People carried Ukrainian flags and shouted, "Stop the war!" Still, the fighting did not stop. Russian forces were strong, but Ukraine was stronger than anyone expected. Soldiers defended every inch of their land. Ordinary citizens became heroes. Some threw themselves in front of tanks. Others stood unarmed, blocking roads. "This is our country," they said. "You cannot take it." President Volodymyr Zelensky became a symbol of hope. He stayed in Kyiv, even as missiles fell around him. In a message to his people, he said, "I am here. We will fight. We will win." His words inspired not just Ukrainians, but the entire world. For children, the war was especially hard. Schools closed, playgrounds became empty. Many had to leave their homes and friends, but even in war, they found small moments of joy. In a cold basement, a little girl sang a lullaby. Her voice brought comfort to everyone around her. In a village outside Kyiv, Mykola, an elderly farmer, decided to fight in his own way. He hid his tractor in the forest and used it to tow away abandoned Russian tanks. When his neighbors asked why he was risking his life, he smiled and said, "Every bit helps." Stories like his spread across the country, giving people hope. The days turned into weeks. The weeks felt like years. The war was far from over, but one thing was clear: Ukraine would not give up. The people showed the world what courage looked like. They stood together, even when everything seemed lost. They kept going, even when the future was uncertain. In every city, every village, and every home, the same words were whispered: "We will survive. We will rebuild. We will win." This was not just a war of tanks and guns. It was a war of hearts. And in the hearts of Ukrainians, there was no room for defeat. Chapter 5. Kyiv stands strong. Kyiv, the capital of Ukraine, is more than just a city. It is the heart of the country. Its streets are full of history. Its people are proud and strong. When Russia invaded, Kyiv became the main target. If Russia could take Kyiv, it could control Ukraine. But the people of Kyiv would not let that happen. At first, there was panic. Sirens filled the air. Explosions lit up the night sky. Families packed bags and ran to shelters. Some tried to leave the city. Cars filled the roads, heading west. Others stayed, not knowing what would happen next. Russian troops moved closer each day. They came with tanks, soldiers, and missiles. Everyone feared the worst. Would Kyiv fall? The Ukrainian army was ready to fight. Soldiers stood guard at every bridge and road. They built barricades with sandbags and metal spikes. Volunteers helped too. Teachers, shopkeepers, and even students joined the fight. They carried rifles, but they also carried hope. Olena, a school teacher, stayed in Kyiv with her husband. "This is my home," she said. "I will not leave." She helped make Molotov cocktails, small homemade bombs, to give to the soldiers. At night, she prayed for her city. One of Kyiv's greatest defenses was the Dnipro River. This wide river flows through the city. Ukrainian forces used it to slow the Russian advance. Bridges were blocked or destroyed. Russian tanks could not cross easily. The streets of Kyiv became battlefields. Gunfire echoed between the buildings. Smoke rose into the sky. In one neighborhood, a group of volunteers stopped a Russian convoy. They stood in the road, waving Ukrainian flags. The tanks stopped. The soldiers did not know what to do. These moments showed the courage of the people. Inside Kyiv, life was difficult. Bombs hit homes and hospitals. The power went out in many areas. People waited in long lines for food and water. Shelters became crowded. But even in these dark times, there was kindness. Neighbors shared what they had. Volunteers brought supplies to those in need. President Volodymyr Zelensky stayed in Kiev during the attack. He refused to leave, even when his life was in danger. "I am here," he told his people. His speeches inspired not just Ukrainians, but the entire world. "We will defend our land," he said. "We will fight for our freedom." The world watched Kiev closely. News reports showed the bravery of its people. Images of destroyed buildings and wounded civilians shocked viewers. Countries around the world sent weapons and aid to Ukraine. They hoped Kyiv would hold. The Battle of Kyiv lasted for weeks. Every day brought new challenges. Russian forces tried to surround the city. They launched missiles at key targets, but Ukraine fought back. Soldiers used small, quick attacks to weaken the enemy. Drones and anti-tank weapons helped stop Russian advances. One night, a group of Ukrainian soldiers defended a small village near Kyiv. They were outnumbered, but they held their ground. The battle lasted all night. When morning came, the Russian forces retreated. These small victories gave the people of Kyiv hope. Ordinary citizens became heroes. Mykola, an older man, drove his truck to deliver food to soldiers. He refused to take money. "This is my duty," he said. A young woman named Yulia rescued stray animals left behind by fleeing families. "They need us," she said. Stories like these spread across the city, reminding people that they were not alone. By the end of March 2022, something incredible happened. The Russian forces began to pull back. They had failed to take Kyiv. The Ukrainian army, with the help of its people, had defended the city. The news spread quickly. People celebrated in the streets. Soldiers waved flags. Families hugged each other. Kyiv had stood strong. But the city was not the same. Many buildings were destroyed. Thousands of people had lost their homes. The scars of war were everywhere. Yet, the spirit of Kyiv remained unbroken. Kyiv's victory was a turning point in the war. It showed the world that Ukraine could resist. It gave hope to other cities still under attack. The battle for Kyiv was over, but the war was far from finished. The people of Ukraine knew they had a long road ahead. Still, they believed in their future. Kyiv had shown that even in the darkest times, courage and unity could light the way. The city stood as a symbol of strength. It was not just a place on a map. It was a heart that refused to stop beating. And that heart continued to inspire Ukraine and the world. Chapter 6. Life under attack. War changes everything. For the civilians of Ukraine, life became a daily fight for survival. Bombs fell from the sky. Homes were turned into rubble. Cities once full of laughter became silent and broken. People faced a new reality, one they had never imagined. Ola lived in Mariupol, a city under constant attack. She had a small apartment on the second floor of a gray building. It was her home, her safe place. But one day, everything changed. A missile hit a building nearby, shaking the ground. The windows shattered. smoke filled the air. "Grab your things," Olha shouted to her son, Maxim. He was only 9 years old. His hands shook as he stuffed his backpack with a few toys and clothes. They ran to the basement with their neighbors. There, they sat in the cold and dark, waiting for the bombing to stop. Outside, the streets were unrecognizable. Cars were burned. Shops were destroyed. There was no water, no electricity, and no food. People stood in long lines, hoping for bread. Some carried empty buckets, searching for clean water. Every day was a struggle. In Kharkiv, another city under attack, people lived underground. Metro stations became shelters. Families slept on blankets spread across the floors. Children played with sticks and stones, trying to forget the sounds of war above. Katerina, a nurse, stayed in Kharkiv to help the wounded. She worked in a small, damaged hospital. The lights flickered and supplies were low. "We had no time to rest," she said. "People kept coming, and we had to save them." She often walked home under the cover of night, dodging falling debris. Amid the chaos, there were moments of kindness. Neighbors shared food and blankets. Volunteers brought medicine to the sick. In one village, a group of women baked bread using an old outdoor oven. "It's not much," one of them said, "but it keeps people alive." Even during the hardest days, Ukrainians found ways to stay hopeful. A music teacher in Kyiv played his violin in the streets. His songs brought tears to the eyes of those passing by. "We need beauty," he said, "even in war." Young people became messengers of hope. Danilo, a 15-year-old boy, delivered packages of food to elderly neighbors. He rode his bike through dangerous streets, dodging checkpoints and rubble. "I'm not scared," he said. "This is my home, and I want to help." Animals were not forgotten either. Refugees carried their pets with them, even as they fled their homes. In Lviv, a shelter cared for stray dogs and cats left behind. Volunteers worked day and night to feed them and keep them safe. But not every story had a happy ending. Many families were separated. Parents sent their children to safer places while they stayed behind. Tears filled the train stations as mothers hugged their children goodbye. "Be brave," they whispered. "We will see each other again." Winter came, and life grew even harder. Snow covered the ruins of cities. The air was icy, and the wind cut through broken windows. People burned scraps of wood to keep warm. Yet they endured. They told stories by candlelight. They sang songs about hope and freedom. In the small town of Bucha, Serhiy, a farmer, became a local hero. When supplies ran out, he used his tractor to bring food from nearby villages. He risked his life every day, driving through dangerous areas. "People are hungry," he said. "I can't sit and do nothing." The bravery of civilians inspired the world. Videos of Ukrainians helping each other spread online. People from other countries sent money, clothes, and food. A woman in Poland opened her home to 20 refugees. "We are neighbors," she said. "We must help." Despite the suffering, Ukrainians refused to give up. They found strength in small acts of courage. A child drawing pictures on the walls of a shelter. A grandmother knitting scarves for soldiers. A family planting flowers in a bombed garden. These moments reminded everyone that life goes on, even in the face of destruction. By spring, some cities began to rebuild. People returned to their homes, even if they were damaged. They picked up the pieces, brick by brick. They swept the streets and repaired windows. Hope was still alive. The war was far from over, but the spirit of Ukraine remained unbroken. Civilians showed that bravery does not always mean holding a weapon. Sometimes it means sharing bread, caring for others, or simply refusing to give up. In the darkest days, kindness shone like a light. It warmed hearts and gave people the strength to keep going. Life under attack was hard, but the courage of the people made it bearable. They stood together, proving that even in war, humanity cannot be destroyed. Chapter 7. The world responds. When Russia invaded Ukraine, the world watched in shock. Images of bombed buildings and crying children filled the news. People everywhere asked the same question: what can we do to help? The first response came from Ukraine's neighbors. Countries like Poland, Romania, and Hungary opened their borders. Refugees flooded in, carrying bags, pets, and children. Some walked for hours, even days, to reach safety. They left everything behind: homes, jobs, schools. But they found kindness waiting for them. In Poland, towns turned schools and gyms into shelters. Volunteers brought food, blankets, and toys for the children. Families welcomed strangers into their homes. "They are our neighbors," one woman said. "We cannot turn them away." But not everyone felt the same. Some countries worried about the war spreading. "What if Russia attacks us next?" they asked. Fear grew, especially in nations close to Ukraine. They sent soldiers to their borders, preparing for the worst. Meanwhile, leaders around the world held emergency meetings. They wanted to stop the war, but how? Diplomats talked for hours. They called for peace. They signed agreements, but nothing changed. The fighting continued. Then came the sanctions. Many countries stopped trading with Russia. They banned Russian oil and gas. Businesses closed their doors in Moscow. Banks froze Russian money. The goal was clear: hurt Russia's economy to end the war. But the sanctions had a price. Energy costs rose. People in Europe and beyond faced higher bills for heating and electricity. Still, most said, it is a small price to pay. Military aid soon followed. The United States, Europe, and other allies sent weapons and equipment to Ukraine. Trucks carried rifles, helmets, and medical supplies. Planes delivered anti-tank missiles and drones. These tools gave Ukrainian soldiers a fighting chance. "Thank you," a soldier in Kiev said. "With these, we can protect our home." Ordinary people around the world joined the effort. They donated money and supplies. Churches held fundraisers. Schools collected clothes and toys for Ukrainian children. A bakery in Canada sold blue and yellow cookies, sending the profits to refugees. From big cities to small towns, the message was the same. We stand with Ukraine. But not all support was welcomed. Some leaders hesitated to send weapons. What if it makes the war worse? They asked. Others worried about provoking Russia. This could lead to World War III, they warned. The debates were heated. Some nations acted boldly. Others chose caution. As the months passed, the war brought unexpected challenges. Countries accepting refugees faced pressure. Cities became crowded. Schools and hospitals struggled to keep up. In Germany, a mayor said, "We want to help, but we need help too." Still, most people stood by Ukraine. "These families have lost everything," a teacher in France said. "We must do our part." One story stood out. In a small town in Italy, a Ukrainian boy named Artem joined a new school. He spoke no Italian and felt scared, but his classmates made him feel welcome. They painted his desk in blue and yellow, the colors of the Ukrainian flag. "You are one of us now," they told him. Artem smiled for the first time in weeks. In the United States, Ukrainian communities held rallies. They waved flags and sang songs from home. "We will not let the world forget," one speaker said. Their voices echoed across continents. Celebrities and musicians joined in, raising money and awareness. Still, the question remained, how far would the world go? Some called for peace talks. Others demanded more weapons. Ukraine's President Zelensky asked for more support. "We are fighting for freedom," he said. "Not just for Ukraine, but for everyone." The war also brought unexpected heroes. Journalists risked their lives to report the truth. Doctors flew to Ukraine to treat the wounded. Engineers helped repair power lines in bombed cities. Even farmers played a role. They planted crops in dangerous fields to keep the world fed. Their bravery inspired millions. Despite all the help, Ukraine faced immense challenges. Cities were destroyed. Millions had no homes. Yet, the support gave them hope. Every donation, every act of kindness reminded Ukrainians that they were not alone. By the end of 2022, the world's response had grown stronger. Nations united in ways never seen before. "Together, we can make a difference," a young woman in London said as she packed boxes of food for refugees. Her words reflected the spirit of many. But the road ahead was uncertain. Would the help be enough? Could the war truly end? No one knew the answers. Yet, one thing was clear. The world had chosen to stand with Ukraine. In times of great darkness, it showed that kindness, courage, and unity could shine through. The people of Ukraine would never forget this support. It gave them strength to keep going. And for those who helped, it was a reminder of what humanity can achieve when we come together. Chapter 8. The Fight for the South. The battle for southern Ukraine was one of the most important parts of the war. The region was rich in farmland and water. It also connected Ukraine to the Black Sea. Losing it would mean losing a vital lifeline. But Ukraine soldiers were determined. They would not give up. Kherson, a city in the south, became a symbol of this fight. It was one of the first cities captured by Russian forces in 2022. Russian troops entered quickly, raising their flags on government buildings. For months, the people of Kherson lived under occupation. They were afraid, but also defiant. Larissa, a shopkeeper in Kherson, remembered the day Russian soldiers arrived. "They told us to stay inside," she said, "but we didn't listen. We marched in the streets, waving Ukrainian flags." The protests didn't last long. Russian soldiers cracked down hard. People were arrested. Some were never seen again. Life under Russian control was harsh. Food and medicine were scarce. People whispered to each other in fear. But even in the darkest moments, small acts of resistance gave hope. Larissa hid a Ukrainian flag in her attic. She would take it out at night and look at it. "It reminded me who I was," she said. Meanwhile, Ukrainian forces were planning a counterattack. The South was too important to lose. Soldiers trained in secret. They received new weapons from their allies. The goal was clear: take back Kherson. The offensive began in the summer of 2022. Ukrainian soldiers moved step by step, village by village. The terrain was flat and open, making it hard to advance. Russian troops had built strong defenses. Fields were full of landmines. Every step forward was dangerous. In one small village, a group of Ukrainian soldiers faced heavy fire. They hid in a barn, waiting for the right moment to move. "We could hear the Russians talking," said one soldier, Artem. "They were so close." When the shooting stopped, Artem and his team pushed forward. The village was freed, but the cost was high. For the people living in these villages, liberation was both joyful and heartbreaking. Olha, an elderly woman, cried when she saw Ukrainian soldiers enter her street. "You came back," she said, hugging them. But her joy turned to sorrow when she looked at her home. It was destroyed. By November 2022, Ukrainian forces were close to Kherson. The fighting grew intense. Russian troops tried to hold their positions, but they were running out of supplies. Step by step, Ukraine pushed them back. One night, under the cover of darkness, Ukrainian soldiers crossed the Dnipro River. It was a risky move. The current was strong, and Russian snipers watched the banks. But they made it. The next morning, the Ukrainian flag flew on the other side. Inside Kherson, the people waited. Every explosion made them jump. They hoped it would end soon. When the first Ukrainian soldiers entered the city, the streets filled with cheers. People waved flags. They cried and hugged the soldiers. "We waited for you," they said. The victory was historic, but it came at a great cost. Many soldiers had died. Homes were destroyed. Families were torn apart. The scars of war were everywhere. But Kherson was free. This victory gave Ukraine hope. It showed that they could fight back, even against a stronger enemy. It also sent a message to the world. Ukraine would not surrender. After the battle, the people of Kherson began to rebuild. Volunteers brought food and water. Engineers worked to restore electricity. Children played in the streets again, even as the sounds of war echoed in the distance. But the fight for the South was far from over. Russian forces regrouped on the other side of the Dnipro River. Missiles continued to hit the city. The people knew the danger was not gone. Yet, they remained strong. The fight for Kherson became a symbol of Ukraine's resilience. It showed that courage, determination, and unity could overcome even the hardest challenges. The people of Kherson proved that no matter how dark the night, the sun would rise again. Victory was close, but the cost was high. And yet, for Ukraine, it was worth it. The South was theirs again, and they would protect it with everything they had. Chapter 9. A Winter of Hardship. Winter came to Ukraine, and with it came new challenges. Snow covered the ground, making the world look peaceful for a moment. But the reality was far from peaceful. Cities were cold and dark. The war had destroyed power plants and heating systems. Without electricity, people had no way to stay warm. In Kyiv, Olena and her family lived in their small apartment. The lights had gone out weeks ago. The heater was cold to the touch. She wrapped her children in blankets and told them stories to keep their minds off the cold. "We will get through this," she whispered, though her own hands trembled. Outside, the streets were empty. Ice covered the sidewalks, and the wind howled through broken windows. Shops were closed. People lined up for food and water, their breath visible in the freezing air. Some wore mismatched clothes, anything to stay warm. Volunteers set up soup kitchens in bombed-out buildings. A woman named Katya ladled hot soup into bowls for the people in her neighborhood. She worked all day, even though her own house had no heat. "We must take care of each other," she said. In the eastern city of Kharkiv, conditions were even worse. Entire neighborhoods had been destroyed. People lived in underground shelters to escape the cold and the bombs. They burned scraps of wood and old furniture to stay warm. Children played with sticks and rocks in the dim light of candles. Victor, an older man, refused to leave his home in a small village near Kherson. His roof was damaged, and the snow came through the cracks. He wore 3 coats and slept under layers of blankets. Every morning, he went outside to feed his chickens. "They depend on me," he said with a tired smile. The nights were the hardest. Without electricity, the world was silent and dark. Families gathered around candles or flashlights, sharing stories or singing songs. A woman named Maria sat with her neighbors, knitting scarves for soldiers on the front lines. "This is how we fight," she said. But even in the darkness, there were moments of light. In Lviv, a music teacher named Andriy played his accordion on the street. The sound echoed through the cold air, drawing a small crowd. People clapped and sang along, forgetting their worries for a moment. In another part of Ukraine, a little girl named Sophia decorated her shelter with paper snowflakes. She hung them on the walls and smiled proudly. "It feels like Christmas," she told her mother. Despite the hardships, Ukrainians found ways to endure. Farmers shared potatoes and onions with their neighbors. A baker used a wood stove to make bread for his village. Doctors worked in freezing hospitals, using flashlights to perform surgeries. The world noticed Ukraine's struggle. Countries sent generators, blankets, and fuel to help. Aid workers brought food and medicine. A team of engineers traveled to Ukraine to repair power lines. "We can't stop the war," one of them said, "but we can help the people survive." But survival came at a cost. The cold took its toll on the weak and elderly. Hospitals were full of people suffering from frostbite and illness. The war had already taken so much, and now winter added to the pain. Still, Ukrainians refused to give up. They found strength in small things: a candle burning brightly in a window, a hot cup of tea shared with a friend, the laughter of children playing in the snow. These moments reminded them of what they were fighting for: their home, their freedom, and their future. By January, the days were still short and cold. But the people of Ukraine were stronger than the winter. They worked together, helping each other survive. They knew the road ahead would be long and hard, but they also knew that spring would come. The winter of hardship tested Ukraine in every way. Yet, through the cold and darkness, the people endured. They showed the world that even in the most difficult times, hope can shine like a flame in the night. And so, they waited for the sun to rise again. They waited for peace. But most of all, they waited for spring, when the snow would melt and the flowers would bloom once more. Chapter 10. Stories of Heroes. War creates heroes, but not all heroes wear uniforms. In Ukraine, bravery came in many forms. Nurses, teachers, farmers, and everyday people became symbols of resistance. Each had a story of courage, sacrifice, and hope. Larissa, a nurse in Kharkiv, was one such hero. When the bombs began to fall, many hospitals were destroyed, but Larissa refused to stop working. She moved from house to house, carrying a small bag of medical supplies. In one home, she delivered a baby by candlelight. In another, she bandaged a soldier's wounds. "I am not a fighter," she said, "but I can save lives." In a small town near Kyiv, a teacher named Oksana stayed behind when her students fled. She turned her classroom into a shelter, covering the windows with blankets to block out the cold. Oksana gathered books from the ruins of the library and read to the children every night. "Stories can keep us alive," she told them. Her soft voice brought comfort in the darkest hours. Farmers, too, became heroes. Mykola, an old man with a weathered face, refused to leave his land. Russian soldiers marched through his fields, but he stayed. "This soil is my home," he said. When the soldiers left behind tanks and trucks, Mykola found a way to fight back. Using his tractor, he towed the abandoned vehicles to safety, turning them over to Ukrainian forces. His quiet defiance inspired an entire village. In Mariupol, a young girl named Katya showed the courage of a warrior. Her family's apartment was destroyed, but she carried her violin wherever they went. In a crowded shelter, she played songs of hope. Her music brought tears to the eyes of soldiers and strangers alike. "I can't stop the war," she said, but I can make people feel stronger. Some stories were tragic, yet they showed the strength of the human spirit. In Bucha, a mother named Svitlana hid her children in the basement while Russian troops searched her home. She told them to stay silent, even as her hands shook with fear. When the soldiers left, she hugged her children tightly. "We will survive," she whispered. But there were also stories of triumph. In a village near Kherson, a group of women secretly cooked meals for Ukrainian soldiers. They used old ovens and hid the food in baskets, sneaking it past Russian checkpoints. One of the women, Olha, said, "They have guns, but we have courage." Their bravery kept the soldiers fed and strong. Even the youngest Ukrainians became symbols of hope. 8-year-old Maxim from Lviv drew pictures of sunflowers, the symbol of Ukraine, and gave them to refugees. "Take this," he said. "It will remind you of home." His small act of kindness touched everyone he met. In Kyiv, a group of engineers worked day and night to repair damaged power lines. They faced freezing temperatures and the constant threat of attack. But they refused to stop. "We're not just fixing wires," one engineer said. "We're bringing light back to our people." Around the world, these stories spread. They reminded people that war is not just about armies and battles. It is about ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Each story showed the strength of the Ukrainian spirit. But being a hero often came with a cost. Many paid the ultimate price for their courage. Volunteers delivering food to frontline towns risked their lives every day. Nurses and doctors worked until they could no longer stand. Teachers taught in ruins, and farmers planted crops under the threat of missiles. Still, these heroes never gave up. They knew their efforts mattered. A single act of kindness, a single brave decision could make a difference. And it did. Their courage inspired their neighbors, their communities, and even the world. Ukraine's heroes did not fight for medals or glory. They fought for each other. They fought for their homes, their families, and their future. Their stories remind us that true heroism is not about being fearless. It is about acting in spite of fear. As the war continued, more stories of heroes emerged. Some were shared around the world. Others remained quiet, known only to a small circle of friends and family. But every story mattered. Every story was a thread in the fabric of Ukraine's resistance. The heroes of Ukraine showed that bravery is not just on the battlefield. It is in the hands of a nurse, the voice of a teacher, the strength of a farmer, and the heart of a child. And in the darkest times, their light guided the way forward. Their stories will never be forgotten. They are the soul of Ukraine, a nation united, strong, and unbreakable. Chapter 11. Hope on the Horizon. The war had lasted for years. Ukraine had faced destruction, loss, and pain. Cities were left in ruins, and families had been separated. But through it all, the spirit of the people never broke. Slowly, life began to return. There was hope on the horizon. In Kyiv, schools reopened their doors. Teachers welcomed children back into classrooms. The walls were still marked with cracks, but the laughter of students filled the air. Olena, a teacher, stood at the front of her class. She held up a book and smiled. "Today, we begin again," she said. The children listened closely. For many, it was their first day back at school in years. Markets began to reopen as well. In Kharkiv, farmers set up tables filled with potatoes, carrots, and apples. People came with baskets, eager to buy fresh food. The sound of voices bargaining and laughing made the city feel alive again. A woman named Katya sold sunflowers at her stall. "These flowers remind us that life always finds a way," she said. In the countryside, fields of wheat and sunflowers grew tall. Farmers worked tirelessly, plowing the soil and planting seeds. Mykola, an elderly farmer, stood in his field, wiping sweat from his brow. "This land has seen war," he said, "but now it will grow food again." His tractor hummed as he worked from dawn until dusk. In Lviv, musicians played in the town square. A violinist stood under a tree, his music drifting through the air. Crowds gathered to listen, some singing along. For a moment, the war seemed far away. "Music heals the soul," said Andrei, the violinist. His songs brought smiles to faces that had known too much sadness. But rebuilding was not easy. Many cities were still damaged. In Mariupol, entire neighborhoods were gone. Roads were filled with rubble. Volunteers worked day and night, clearing debris and rebuilding homes. Petro, a construction worker, stood on a ladder, hammering nails into a wooden frame. "It will take time," he said, "but we will rebuild brick by brick." Refugees who had fled the country began to return. At the train station in Kyiv, families reunited. Mothers hugged their children tightly, tears streaming down their faces. One man, Yuri, stepped off the train holding a small suitcase. "I never thought I'd see my home again," he said, looking around the city he loved. Still, peace was far away. Fighting continued in some parts of the country. Soldiers guarded the borders, watching for any sign of danger. Explosions could still be heard in the distance. People lived with the constant reminder that the war was not over. Despite this, hope remained. Ukrainians found strength in each other. Communities worked together, sharing food, tools, and stories. A young boy named Maxim painted murals on the walls of damaged buildings. He used bright colors, blue skies, green fields, and golden sunflowers. "I want people to feel happy when they see this," he said. In the face of uncertainty, dreams began to grow. Young people talked about the future. They wanted to rebuild their schools, open new businesses, and create art. "This war will not define us," said Yulia, a university student. "We will create a better Ukraine." International help also played a role. Countries sent money and supplies to support rebuilding efforts. Engineers came to repair bridges. Doctors trained local staff in modern hospitals. "The world has not forgotten us," said Sir Hai, a mayor in a small town. "Together, we will heal." The rebuilding was not just about buildings and roads. It was about healing hearts. Psychologists held workshops for children who had experienced trauma. Churches and community centers opened their doors to those in need. People gathered to share meals, songs, and prayers. "We are stronger when we are together," said Larissa, a community leader. But as the people rebuilt, questions remained. Would the fighting ever end? Could peace truly be achieved? Many Ukrainians dreamed of a day when their country would be whole again. They dreamed of a time when their children could grow up without fear. The future was uncertain, but hope was alive. It was in the classrooms where children wrote stories of a better tomorrow. It was in the markets where neighbors greeted each other with smiles. It was in the fields where farmers planted seeds for a new season. And it was in the hearts of every Ukrainian beating strong and steady. Hope on the horizon did not mean the end of struggle, but it meant the beginning of something new. A brighter day was coming, and Ukraine was ready to welcome it. Peace would take time, but the people were determined. Together, they would rebuild their country and their lives. They would not forget the past, but they would look forward to the future. And in every act of kindness, every new beginning, there was a simple truth. Hope was enough to keep them going. Chapter 11. Hope on the Horizon. After years of war, Ukraine began to rebuild. The destruction was everywhere: broken buildings, empty streets, and quiet towns. But slowly, life returned. People worked hard to bring back what they had lost. Hope started to grow again. In Kyiv, schools reopened. Teachers welcomed children into classrooms. Desks were scratched and walls were cracked, but the laughter of students filled the air. Olena, a young teacher, stood in front of her class. "Today, we learn not just about math," she said, smiling. "We learn how to dream again." Markets also reopened. Farmers brought fresh produce to sell: potatoes, onions, and apples. Villages that had been silent were now alive with the sound of voices. Families gathered to buy food and share stories. Katya, a farmer, set up her stall and handed out sunflowers to her customers. "These flowers remind us of brighter days," she said. In the countryside, the fields came back to life. Farmers planted wheat and sunflowers, even though the soil was scarred by war. Mykola, an elderly farmer, looked at his land and sighed. "This ground has seen bombs and fire," he said, "but now it will see life again." His hands worked the soil, planting seeds for a new beginning. In the city of Lviv, artists and musicians brought hope in their own way. Andriy, a violinist, played in the streets. His music floated through the air, drawing people to listen. Some sang along, while others simply closed their eyes and smiled. "Music has power," he said. "It reminds us of who we are." Rebuilding was not easy. In towns like Mariupol, The destruction was severe. Buildings were in ruins, roads were filled with rubble. Volunteers worked day and night, clearing the streets and repairing homes. Petro, a construction worker, climbed a ladder to fix a roof. "It will take time," he said, "but we will rebuild everything, brick by brick." Refugees began to return home. At the train stations, families reunited with tears and hugs. Yuri, a father of two, stepped off the train holding his suitcase. He looked around the city he had left behind and said, "It feels good to be back. This is where we belong." Despite the rebuilding, peace was still far away. Fighting continued in some parts of the country. Soldiers guarded the borders, keeping watch for any attacks. Explosions could still be heard in the distance. People lived with fear, but also with determination. Communities worked together to support one another. Neighbors shared food, tools, and stories. In one town, a boy named Maxim painted bright murals on the walls of broken buildings. His pictures showed blue skies, golden fields, and smiling faces. "I want people to feel happy again," he said. Young people dreamed of a better future. Yulia, a university student, planned to open a small business. "This war will not define us," she said. "We will rebuild stronger than before." Help also came from outside Ukraine. Other countries sent money and supplies. Engineers traveled to repair bridges and power lines. Doctors arrived to help in hospitals. "The world has not forgotten us," said Serhiy, a mayor of a small town. "We are not alone." Rebuilding was not just about fixing buildings. It was about healing hearts. Psychologists helped children who had seen terrible things. Churches and community centers opened their doors to those in need. People came together to share meals and songs, reminding each other that they were not alone. Yet, questions remained. Could Ukraine find peace? Would the war ever truly end? These questions hung in the air like heavy clouds, but the people refused to lose hope. They believed that one day their country would be whole again. Hope was everywhere. It was in the classrooms, where children learned to write and dream. It was in the markets, where neighbors greeted each other with smiles. It was in the fields, where farmers planted seeds for a new harvest. And it was in the hearts of every Ukrainian who refused to give up. Life was still hard, but it was moving forward. Ukraine had faced destruction, but it had not been defeated. Its people were strong, united, and full of hope. They knew the road ahead would be long, but they also knew they could walk it together. Hope on the horizon did not mean the end of struggle, but it meant the beginning of something new. It meant the chance to rebuild not just a country, but a future. And for Ukraine, that hope was enough. Chapter 12. A Future Unwritten. The war left scars on Ukraine. Cities were damaged. Fields were burned. Families were torn apart. But Ukraine stood proud. It survived. The people endured the darkest days and refused to give up. Their strength became their symbol. Every corner of Ukraine held a story. In Kiev, The streets were lively again. Markets bustled with people buying and selling. Schools echoed with children's laughter. New buildings replaced old ruins. "We are rebuilding our home," said Olena, a teacher. "Brick by brick, step by step." Her words carried hope. In the countryside, farmers worked tirelessly. Mikola, now in his 70s, walked through his wheat fields. The land had been damaged by war, but it was alive again. Golden wheat swayed in the breeze. "This is my legacy," he said, "for my children, for their children." But not everything could be repaired so easily. The war left invisible scars. Families mourned loved ones who never came home. Children remembered the sound of sirens and the fear of hiding underground. Some towns were still too damaged to rebuild. Yet, even in their sorrow, the people found strength. They leaned on one another. They shared stories. They reminded each other of what they had overcome. What comes next? Nobody knows. The road ahead is uncertain. Some parts of Ukraine are still dangerous. In the east, soldiers remain on guard. The threat of new attacks hangs in the air. But the people are not afraid. They have faced fear before, and they will face it again if they must. "We are not the same country we were before," said Yulia, a university student. "We are stronger now." Around the world, people continue to watch Ukraine's journey. Aid comes in the form of money, supplies, and words of encouragement. Leaders discuss peace, but no final agreement has been made. Ukrainians, however, are not waiting for others to decide their fate. They are building their future themselves. In Lviv, Andriy, the violinist, now plays for crowds at festivals. His music celebrates life, love, and hope. "Music heals," he says. "It brings people together." In Mariupol, volunteers plant trees in the ashes of old neighborhoods. "This is for the future," says Petro, a construction worker. "For the next generation." Young people like Maxim dream big. He paints murals on walls that were once marked by bullets. His artwork shows bright sunflowers, blue skies, and smiling faces. "These walls tell a new story," he says. "A story of hope." Ukraine is rebuilding, but the path is not easy. The economy is weak. Millions of people still need help. But the spirit of the nation is strong. Every challenge is met with determination. Every obstacle becomes a chance to grow. "We have been through so much," says Larissa, a nurse, "but we are still standing." Freedom is what Ukrainians value most. It is what they fought for. It is what they will continue to defend. "We are free," said President Zelensky in a recent speech. "And we will stay free." His words inspire a country that refuses to bow down. What will the future hold? No one can say. But Ukrainians believe in their country. They believe in their people. They believe that brighter days are ahead. Together, they will write the next chapter. The war may have left scars, but it did not destroy Ukraine's soul. It did not break its spirit. It only made the people stronger, more united, more determined. They will keep fighting, not just with weapons, but with ideas, with art, with love for their land. The story of Ukraine is not finished. It is a story of resilience, courage, and hope. It is a story that inspires the world. And it is a story still being written day by day by every Ukrainian who dreams of peace and a better tomorrow. The future is unwritten, but it is theirs to create. Together, they will build it. Together, they will shape it. And together, they will make sure Ukraine remains a land of freedom, strength, and pride.